Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, well, virtually here today. Uh, right, I'm as I said, I'm Hugh Hanmer. I am a research ecologist at the BTO, working on a variety of projects, particularly on urban birds, things like bird feeding, but also on demography, so how our bird populations are changing, looking at using bird ringing data and nest records data. I am also a bird ringer and a bird watcher from a young age, so I've been including quite a close connection to owls. But part of my last couple of years of work has involved working directly on owls. So I'm going to talk to you about our owls and some BTO research from them. So kind of before I kick off, I just want to kind of get everybody thinking about why as a nation of bird lovers do we love owls? What is it about them? Is it the big staring eyes that look straight back out of us? Is it the mystery about them, the silent flight through the night? Say, as a nation of bird lovers, we love them, but they are both fascinating and mysterious. But to a scientist, a researcher, they're a bit of a pain because they are that mysterious. There's a lot of things about them that we don't know and are not easily going to find out. Things are quite basic information sometimes, which makes them quite hard to think about their conservation and their status. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of kind of our breeding owl species, and then look at a couple of research projects. I'm going to kick off with the tawny owl, our commonest owl species. So they are the owl we are most likely to hear. And if you've ever been kept awake by them or woken up by them, you'll know about it. I certainly have when I was younger, living at home with my parents in rural Northumberland. Uh, they are a commonest owl species. We reckon there's about 50,000 pairs, and they are doing reasonably well, possibly declining a little. But they are pretty much everywhere in Britain, on mainland Britain, where we have trees, and plus some of our kind of our more wooded islands. So the Inner Hebrides, like places like Islay and Skye and Mull. But they are officially absent from Ireland, despite occasional reports, and also from the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Isles. And that's in part because they don't like crossing water, but also there aren't any trees in these islands, so there isn't really anywhere for them to be as such. They do, one of the special things about our tawny owls is the fact they do live a long time compared to most species of birds, especially land birds. So our oldest known tawny owl is 23 and a half, was 23 and a half years old, and ringed as a nestling, and that was when she was last seen alive as a female. But as I said, indicated, they don't really go anywhere. So she moves a whole 3 kilometers in her entire life that we know of. And okay, they don't normally live this long. 3 or 4 years is kind of more typical. But they don't go anywhere. But you'll hopefully see that it says Iceland. Now, why would I say that? Have that if they don't like crossing the sea? Well, we did have an issue a few years ago. We had a foreign recovery of a ring from a tawny owl from Iceland, but which is like, wait, what? This can't be happening. But on investigation, we found that this was a tawny owl ringed as a nestling here in England, and it subsequently died in the nest, sadly. Another ringer had come along afterwards in the following winter and cleaned out the nest, as we try to do with nest boxes, and they took the ring away so it didn't accidentally get reported again. And they put in a binocular strap, which is quite common amongst birders, particularly ringers. And when he was in Iceland birding, his binocular strap broke. And so we still don't have a foreign recovery of a tawny owl, and I don't anticipate getting one anytime soon. So onto a different species. So in my experience, many people's favourite, the little owl. But they are slightly complicated in the fact that they are an introduced species. In fact, there were attempts from the 19th century. There were attempts in the 1850s and 60s to introduce them into Hampshire and Yorkshire, which weren't successful. But they were then introduced successfully in the 1870s in Kent and the 1880s in Northamptonshire. Basically, it's an ornamental bird as far as we can make out. But one of the things you might notice with them is that they are introduced species, and you will hear conservationists getting quite worried about introduced species, and particularly terming them invasive. In the case of little owl, they're pretty harmless as it comes to introduced species, because basically they are a small nocturnal raptor. We don't have any native species of that, so they're filling in a niche that nobody else is occupying. So that makes them probably pretty harmless, albeit they are declining, and because they are introduced, we are less likely to look at them and understand why. Although it's likely due to agriculture intensification and reductions in big invertebrates, because unlike our other owl species, little owls like to eat insects and worms and other things like that, as well as small mammals. They have spread basically from sort of the mid 20th century. They spread to, well, pretty much all of England, into Wales, and just into the borders of Scotland. But they have been declining more recently. And we reckon currently there's about 3,500 pairs or so. They're about half the size of the tawny owl, and so you might not be surprised to learn they actually live about half as long. So our oldest known little owl is just under 14 years old, and again, all that time, he didn't go anywhere. A whole 2 kilometers moved. Now, onto a more mysterious bird. So the short-eared owl, I think, if you've seen them, you might more seen them or heard about. You might more associate them with the winter, particularly on the coast, because they spread pretty much across Britain and Ireland in the winter. So concentrate on the coast, but in the breeding season, they're a bit more restricted. At least the British breeding population is. So they're primarily found in the northern uplands, North Wales, uplands there, and in Scotland in the uplands, but also on islands with voles, because that is their main food type. We don't really know how many there are because they're quite hard to survey, and they're also nomadic. So they can pop up 1 year, so particularly on places like the Norfolk and Essex coast, etc., and then they can disappear again the next year, and you don't know if we don't know if they've died and they're not returned, or they have literally just moved on. And one interesting thing about them, well, that kind of possibly reflects their lifestyle, is they don't seem to live very long. So they are intermediate in size between little owl and tawny owl, but the oldest known bird is under 7 years old. And this was a bird that was ringed in Ayrshire in Scotland in the mid-50s and was subsequently sadly shot in Ireland in the early 60s. And so for a bird of this size, we'd expect it to live longer. But probably the reason why it doesn't live very long is, say, the lifestyle it lives. So we do know they migrate. They move into Britain and out of Britain, particularly in the winter. And we do have a movement of a bird from Lincolnshire to Russia for 2,500 kilometers, again, sadly shot, in the 70s. But we have equivalent movements of birds to the north of Norway, to Iceland, to Malta and Morocco. So it's quite clear these birds get about, even if there aren't very many of them. Now on to the other mysterious species. So long-eared owls are probably one of the species that we know least about breeding in the UK in any number, because they are quite widespread. Although you wouldn't necessarily know about this because they're rarely seen unless you encountered So that is the hooting of a male long-eared owl. So it's territorial behavior that they have in early spring, well, late sort of February, March for the most part, as part of their displaying. And if you hear it, you know there are long-eared owls, but your odds of hearing it and looking in the right place are quite low. But what we can do is listen out for something different. So that is the so-called squeaky gate. And this is a noise that is made by older chicks, essentially, in parts possibly demanding food. But it's quite, if you hear it, you know about it. We do have, I'm based near Thetford, where the BTO is based, and we do have them breeding in Thetford Forest, which is conifer plantation. And we do on an autumn evening, you can go out in the forest and you can hear this squeaky gate going, squeaking away. But this does mean we have an issue in that how many do we have? If we survey at the right time, we might hear the males displaying, although that's quite a lot of luck. And if we look in the summer, we might well hear the chicks. Problem is, what happens if we miss the birds displaying, and then they fail, growing eggs or young chicks before they make these noises, or we just miss them altogether. That means we really don't know how many there are. But we do know they're quite widespread, so this is the distribution in the winter. And the reason why we have reasonable information on the winter is they form roosts. These are the so-called Parliament of Owls owl. So in Britain, you'd be lucky to get more than half a dozen birds, but in some parts of the continent, places like Serbia, you can have traditional roosts in the dozens of birds, often in places like villages where remnant bits of woodland that have been preserved. And well, I'd love to go and see that one day, although whether I ever will, I don't know. But that we do not have those numbers. We do have quite a few, and we do know they do breed across Britain. But you might notice if we look in Southern England and Wales for that matter, there's a lot of gaps here. Where if we look in the south of the Republic of Ireland, some parts there seems to be quite a lot. Now the question is why? Are there simply more long-eared owls in Ireland? Or is it because in the last Bird Atlas, which is where this data is from, which is carried out by BTO and partners in 2008, 2011, they went out and specifically looked for them and they found them. So the chances are, if we looked harder, we'd probably find a lot more long-eared owls. We'll be able to sort out this pretty terrible estimate of their population size. They are very closely related to short-eared owls, so you might think they have a similar lifespan, but actually our oldest known bird is somewhat older, so nearly 13. And this is quite an interesting bird in its own right. So it was ringed as a chick in Aberdeenshire, and it was actually recaught a year and a half later in Midlothian, so from northern Scotland to southern Scotland, which is a pretty good movement anyway. So that's valuable information. And then 11 and a half years later, more or less, it was picked up dead, freshly predated in Iceland. So like with short-eared owls, these birds also go somewhere. And in fact, if you look at where we've had recoveries and movements of ringed birds, we actually found we've got a pretty good distribution across Europe. I'm afraid quite a few of these dots are yellow. I don't know why we use that. But we do have a long distance movements of more than 3,000 kilometers from Cumbria to Russia. Again, sadly, this bird came a cropper. But we do have movements, so I'm pretty sure. So as I understand it, this black dot is actually that old bird I just mentioned. And so we've got quite a lot of movement to, and for that matter, from places like northern Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, etc. Another interesting thing about long-eared owls is that we actually find that the birds that do come here, there's a strong bias towards males. And we don't really know why. Perhaps the females are staying close to the breeding grounds, or they're going somewhere else. And I'd really love to plug that gap, but they are quite difficult to study. So on to the kind of the missing owl that I haven't covered so far. So barn owls are probably our second commonest species, give or take. And unlike other species, so little owls are doing poorly, short-eared owls aren't doing especially well. Long-eared owls, we don't know. And tawny owls are kind of stable to maybe slightly declining. Barn owls have done really well in recent years, and a large part of that is down to conservation action. So they have spread throughout much of basically Lowland Britain. So anywhere apart from the mountains and some islands haven't reached, they're doing pretty well. Apart from arguably Northern Ireland, where for whatever reason they haven't really got such a foothold. And the reason for this is in part they're probably a beneficiary of climate change to some extent. So the kind of the warmer, drier summers and milder winters are largely beneficial, although they do get knocked back by extreme weather events like many other species. But on a practical level, it's because we provide nest boxes in big numbers, because historically they would have nested mostly in big hollow field trees and in places like small barns, etc. And over time, we have lost those trees, we've knocked down or converted those barns, but they take to nest boxes. And so we have lots of good foraging habitat, and if we provide nest boxes, they come. And it does mean this population estimate, I feel, is somewhat out of date. So 4,000 to 14,000 pairs. Our old estimate was 4,000 from 10 years ago. I reckon it's probably at least 7,000, maybe 10, 12,000. And part of the evidence for that is the amount of monitoring we do of them. So in 2017, about 3,000 nest records. So the nest record scheme that BTO runs is kind of our main monitoring scheme for monitoring nests, as it says in the tin. And that's a good way of keeping track of how well our bird populations are reproducing. And we say more than 3,000 records, we are not monitoring 3/4 of barn owl breeding temps in Britain. We might be monitoring a quarter, a third, but we're not monitoring 3/4. So I think that's quite useful kind of to back up that they're doing well. Although we kind of need another survey to tell us, which may happen some point in the future. And just to put that in context, in terms of sheer amount of monitoring effort, they were the third most monitored species in 2017. And yeah, so that kind of a huge amount of time and effort from volunteers primarily has gone into producing this data. So thousands of nest boxes have been put up in recent years and say they're doing very well. And they are relatively easy to monitor. Although I should add at this point, they are a Schedule 1 species. So that means they have, under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which essentially means they have special protection from the breeding site above and beyond that what is normal for most birds in the UK. So they can only be monitored under the license. Now I've said they're doing well, and they are, but there are still issues for them. So they are one of our most commonly recovered birds from being hit by cars. And so that can knock them quite badly in some localized areas. And they do suffer in harsh winters quite badly as well. But they do have a secret weapon up their sleeves, or their wings, or whatever. So the average tawny owl will produce about 2 chicks per year, breeding tawny owl female. Barn owls produce more like 3 or 4, and they can also have more than one brood. So that means they can produce a huge number of chicks in a relatively short period of time, and so bounce back from these harsh winters or extreme beast from the east, particularly that knocked them quite badly a couple of years ago, but they bounce back pretty much immediately. So we can, unlike most species, this is less of a concern than it might otherwise be. And they can, despite these issues, also live quite a long time. So our oldest known barn owl was 15.5 years old almost. But again, as with little owl and tawny owl, it didn't move very far. So that moves 6 kilometers in its lifetime. And that's very typical, and say 3-4 years is probably fairly good innings. Kind of to illustrate that, I'm going to introduce you to the story of the barn owl, female barn owl, GR32419. So she was, born in the Middle Thames Valley, more or less, near Marlow, in 2014. And she left the nest along with the rest of her siblings in August that year. And then 1 year later, she was found breeding 6 kilometers away. And it should add that for our owls, at least, it's pretty standard to breed in their first year. Unlike some raptor species who take a bit longer. But anyway, she bred there for 2 years successfully. And then, interestingly, she did actually move 3 kilometers for whatever reason. and bred again successfully. And then, sadly, but possibly unsurprisingly, she was picked up dead on what's dual carriageway in March 2018. So 3.5 years, 12 kilometers, fairly normal. So the only slightly odd thing is she moved in between. But we do get some movement. So it's pretty normal for birds to move more during juvenile dispersal. So that's when the chicks are leaving the area they were born and they spread out into the countryside. So this is from the same study area. And we actually do have dispersal movements of up to almost 80 kilometers, so 50 miles of an individual. But once they've dispersed, they settle down to breed, and then they more or less stay put for their entire life. But we do have some longer distance movements. So we do have, assuming they got there by themselves, as with the tawny owl. But we do have a record of a British ringed barn owl going to Spain and being predated there from Essex. And we do also have some interchange from the continent. So the interesting thing there is that we have a subspecies which is Tito alba alba, which is a very white, they are the ghost barn owl. But we do also in Europe, we have a different subspecies called Tito alba vitara, which is much darker and browner. And if you to see one, in particular in the bird of prey centre, that sort of thing, you would easily see the difference to our pure white ones. But we have had interchange of Dutch ringed birds from that subspecies coming to Britain and breeding. So there is some gene flow there. But you might be wondering why this map is so far zoomed out. And that's because we do have this movement. So in 2006, we had a record from a British ringed barn owl at Camp Bastion in Afghanistan. It was long dead. But it was also ringed in Oxfordshire, very close to the airbase that supplied Camp Bastion. So we think it's rather unlikely it got there of its own accord as well. So as with the tawny owl, sometimes we should be suspicious of these long distance movements. So as a bit of fun, I'm going to touch on another couple of species. So in the last few years, particularly sort of 2018, 19, I think it was, there was some excitement about some snowy owls, about several snowy owls moving about the country. And actually in most years, there is apparently a snowy owl resident on St Kilda, well off Scotland. And they have bred here in the past, but not in recent years. So the last time they bred was in Fetler in Shetland, and actually they in the 1970s, but they had kind of first appeared in 1967. A nest was found. Apparently it had all the nest watching stuff rolled out, so 24-hour surveillance, that sort of thing, to make sure egg feeds got to them, for instance. And that resulted in 7 eggs being laid and 5 young fledging. And the same pair were present for the next 8 years and fledged 16 young. And there were 2 females who were believed to be offspring of this pair around until 1993. So given that they would be about 20 years old at that point, that kind of shows that these birds live longer than most of our smaller owls. But since then, nothing has come of it. So as far as we know, they've not bred anywhere, unless, though it's not entirely impossible, they couldn't have turned it somewhere remote, but it's unlikely. Now the other bird I'm going to mention is a bit more controversial. So the eagle owl, or rather more specifically the Eurasian eagle owl, they are officially a non-native species in Britain. And the vast majority of records, of which we have quite a lot, so this is a map of reports from 1995 to 2009, for example. And there are a lot of points, but the vast majority of these, including some breeding records, can be put down to escapees from falconry and other circumstances. But they could have been present historically. It's plausible, although the fossil record is somewhat lacking. They could have been missed. And they are present in much of Europe and indeed spreading into the places like Belgium. So although they don't like crossing water either, they could potentially end up here in the future. which on one hand would be fantastic because they are a top predator that's missing from our ecosystems. But there is the issue from a conservation point of view, is they are a top predator. They eat pretty much anything they get their talons on, often including other species of conservation concern, particularly often specialised in things like raiding the nests of raptors. So they could cause a bit of a headache if they turned up here of their own accord. So I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you think that's a good thing or not. Right, so I'm going to talk, so that's kind of an overview of our owls, but I'm going to talk about a couple of specific research projects that BTO has carried out as part of our Project Owl, carrying out research and engagement around owls in Britain, essentially, and trying to find out more about them and inform people about them. So we carried out a couple of surveys. The one I'm going to talk about, you may have heard of possibly, is the Tawny Owl Calling Survey. And this was a survey we got people to ask people to carry out from their gardens, essentially, and parks and other places like that. And what we're interested in doing is knowing about what drives the activity, detectability, i.e. when are tawny owls noisy and shout at each other, and their occupancy, i.e. where are they in the first place. We did that over the autumn, winter, early spring of 2018 to 2019. And essentially, we asked people to listen from their gardens for 20 minutes, one evening a week, and record if they heard a tawny owl or not. So, pretty simple survey. We had quite a good uptake, I feel. So, more than 9,500 people took part, submitted usable data, and each of these red squares means there's at least one surveyor in them. Many had multiple, and more than 90,000 surveys were submitted. So 90,000 times 20 minutes is about 3.5 years worth of time. So this is a massive amount of effort, which we're very grateful for. And the headline findings is that 85% people heard tawny owl. So that's pretty impressive, particularly from gardens. And on any given evening, people had just the 50% chance of hearing a tawny owl. That does mean, though, that 15% of people never heard a tawny owl. But as an organization, BTO, and many other people who carry out citizen science surveys, it is really valuable to us that we get zeros. It's just as important knowing where birds and other animals, so plants, invertebrates, etc., where they aren't as well as where they are. So if you ever consider doing a survey, you think, oh no, I won't find said animal, that's still a valuable record potentially. So please do consider it. And what did we find? Well, shock horror, tawny owls, a woodland species like trees. So they were very strongly associated with broadleaf woodlands, which is their primary habitat after all. They did also use conifer woodland, although to a lesser extent. But they did decline with urbanization, but they could still be in very urbanized areas. So to give a bit more of a local flavour, so here we've got a map of London. Central London's here, and blue squares are heard now. People heard now. Red squares they didn't hear now. And as you can see, even in some pretty urban areas, there's a lot more blue squares than there are red. So even in these areas, we still have owls. And if we zoom in further, what I hope is your patch. So patch is that we do still have owls right in here, near the centre of London. So particularly around the parks, so we've got a place like another place like that. So we've got Hampstead Heath up here. Got 20 owls heard from here. Other areas they weren't heard, but it kind of goes to illustrate that tawny owls really can occur anywhere with trees, and London is a grey-green city, so hence they are there. Now, in terms of what the other things we looked at, as I said, we were interested in what drives activity, i.e. when are they being noisy and shouting at each other, because that is essentially what they are doing. Basically, they are more active and more vocal on warm, dry, moonlit nights, which isn't really a surprise, but this is the first time this information is brought together in one survey quite in a clear package. And they're most active in the autumn. And the reason why they're most active in the autumn is we believe is because that's when the juveniles are dispersing. So they leave the place where they were born and then they encounter territorial adults elsewhere, and they basically get into a shouting match. So that's why they are most vocal then. And then in the spring they start calling again, and that again is that territorial behaviour of them prior to breeding. So to come on to a final bit of research on, say, the short-eared owl, as I said, one of our more mysterious species. So BTO Scotland, part of BTO, has been looking into this for some years, and short-eared owls, basically wanting to find out about their habitat usage and movements, because we know, because it's really hard to survey for them, and we know they are nomadic. We know they move around between years. It's very difficult to pin down what they actually need. So what we want to do is find out in the habitat. So a place like this. So this is, I think this is Stirlingshire or Perthshire. Got Scottish uplands. It's a mix of heather and grassland, and we want to know what they actually need in this habitat, and that has important implications for management. So hopefully you can make out these patches are actually bits of heather. Obviously, upland management is a complicated situation, to say the least, and short-eared owls, they consider it conservation should play a part in that. And the traditional way we do that, to kind of find out where birds are using the habitat, is to observe them directly. So you get your surveyor. This is one of my colleagues with their binoculars, and they observe, which does work, but there are issues. One, it's time intensive, so they have to be out there a lot of time to gather information. You may well need quite a few surveyors to actually get enough detailed movement information of where they're actually going. And you have the added complication of, we're looking at an owl. Short-eared owls are probably our most active during the day. So diurnal is the word for that. But they are also active at night. So that means that they are, well, we can't see in the dark particularly well. So there's a lot of information that we miss. So initially, they tried using radio tracking. So you catch your owl, you mount a radio backpack on it, and then generally speaking, you wander around with your radio antennae trying to find it, which does work, but again, it's quite costly. So you need to get this equipment, you need to fit it on your owl, and then you need to, in this sort of environment, tramp about trying to find out where your owl is and what it's doing, which can be hard, and particularly as we want to know what they're doing at night as well. Not fun traveling across this habitat in the nighttime. So what has been a massive development in this area is radio tracking, GPS tagging, and particularly using solar powered tags. You may have heard of our cuckoos. So BTO has been following cuckoos to and from Africa for a number of years now, and that uses a solar powered tag. So that's been extremely valuable information. But they are only turned on every few days. These tags in good conditions can be on every day and give a location every few minutes. That means we have a huge amount of highly detailed information about where they're going, what they're using. So as I said, the first question is, what's important? What habitat are they using in this network, mosaic of habitats? So red dots are heather, so time spent in heather. Yellow dots are grassland, and the blue dots nest. Hopefully what you can see is there's an awful lot more grassland dots than there are heather, which suggests very strongly that the grassland is what's important in this habitat. And that's not just when they're breeding, so that's the tracking of the female from the nest. It's also after they stop breeding. So again, this is the same female, a few months later, and nearly all of her tracks are also in the grassland, which is going to be important when you consider that. Hopefully you can see that this is all patchy, and that's from heather burning. So if we're trying to just get heather, that's not going to be good for the owls. That's something that we need to consider in this environment. But it's not just the habitat use directly that we're interested in. As I said, the main problem traditionally is that we can only really look in the daytime, or at least it's difficult to do the nighttime. a tag with sufficient charge will actually work around the clock. And that means we can look at where they're roaming. So now we have red is daytime, yellow is nighttime. And hopefully you can see that the fact that, generally speaking, the red dots, the daytime dots, are close to the nest. This is two different birds, so there's a male and a female in neighboring nests, which is also really useful tracking birds close together to see if they're doing the same similar things, which they are. But also interesting to note that, well, not a big sample, but the male seems to be going further than the female. This is probably fairly typical. They are foraging further away. But it's not just they're going further away. There's also the fact that they're going, during the daytime, they tend to be down in the kind of lower levels. Whereas in nighttime, they're going to higher altitudes. And we suspect this is because they're trying to avoid nasty things like golden eagles and peregrines that are potentially going to predate them. So essentially, they stay out of those areas in the daytime, and then there's no competition for them at nighttime. But one of the main and most important parts of the study is we're also just interested in what they do when they're not breeding, because that might help us to understand why they disappear from some sites and appear magically in others. And this female in particular, we fitted with a satellite tag in late May 2017 near Stirling, has been particularly eye-opening as to what these birds do. So she was in her breeding area until late June, having been tagged in late May, with raising her chicks. And then come July, she left the male looking after the chicks. So this turns out to be quite normal behaviour. And then basically spent some time further north in Scotland, in Perthshire. Made a brief jaunt down south of Glasgow, which is here. Returned to near the breeding area, and then we came back to this area where she was in the late summer. And then basically potted about in this area of Scotland. So that already suggests that if we looked here in July, we wouldn't be finding her. So that's information that we now know. But we do have a slight issue with these tags. As I mentioned, solar power is one of their great strengths. We're following a bird in Scotland in the late autumn into the winter. Sunlight is not exactly abundant. So the tags were basically programmed to shut off once they reach a minimum power and basically switch back on again once they have enough charge. So we had to hope every winter that would happen, they would switch back on. Which thankfully it did in her case. So come 2018, she was in the same area she spent the late summer, autumn, but she took a quick jaunt to northern Scotland, decided it was too cold and windy, came back to this area, and then pretty much immediately set down to breed. So this is quite early, and kind of underlines the point that, so it also suggests that she was here for a reason. She was scouting out this area for breeding. And well, obviously the fact is she's moved. So if we were to look for her there, she's not there anymore. So that means that our estimate of the population is likely to be off if we don't take this into account that they can move. She again, though, come mid-May, 16th, 17th of May, she left the male looking after the chick again. As I said, this seems to be fairly normal. And I should add that we presume this was a different male. We don't have that. We probably couldn't easily prove that it was the same male, but it's unlikely to be. But anyway, she set off northeast and kept on going. So she took about 16 hours to cross the North Sea, which seems a really good time. And then settled down to, based on the activity on the tag, so we can see that she's basically not moving very much, only very short distances, returned to the same spot. We reckon she laid a second nest, second brood clutch rather, was trying to breed in Norway. So Scotland, Norway, so that's two countries on her list so far. And this is kind of a picture of the habitat where, in the area where she was trying to breed. It's a bit different to Scotland, but it's not so different. Sadly, it appears that she failed pretty early. This is not a long enough time for her to have raised chicks. and say it moves within Norway, and then come the 30th of September, the tag switched off again. So we just had to hope it would come back on, which thankfully it did. And she'd moved to Ireland. So I'd love to know what route she took to get here. We will never know, sadly. But so yes, definitely a third country, and quite possibly a fourth country on the list, fourth or fifth. And basically, she potted around Southern Ireland for next month-ish. And then come the 21st of November, tag went dead again. Just had to hope it would reappear. And it did in February on Dartmoor. So we've definitely been to England now. And she was there for a month and a half. So now it's time to think about breeding. She didn't stay on Dartmoor. She headed across the country, so hit the Norfolk coast. And if we remember the fact that she quite clearly scouted out a new location within Scotland, logically this would suggest she scouted out this location in Norway, so she's going to try and get there, which she does. Unfortunately, after a 28-hour non-stop flight, unfortunately, just off the coast of Norway, she hit a strong northerly with snow, and after 28 hours flight, sadly, she seems to have ditched the sea. So her story ends here. But what a story! We didn't expect this. We knew they moved, but this is frankly ridiculous. But we now tagged a number of birds, and we can get an idea of what they're doing. So unfortunately, it's changed colour because this isn't my map, but this blue bird was that previous bird. And here's another couple of examples of tagged short-eared owls. And they are moving within Scotland, so particularly this bird in orange, which suggests that they are scouting out areas to breed. In fact, this bird did move within Scotland to breed, whereas this bird from Arran went off exploring up the west coast of Scotland and decided that no, it would go back to Arran. We do have mutes in the country as well, or Britain and Ireland rather. So another bird that went to Ireland, interestingly by the Pennines essentially, and Scotland, back to Scotland, and then down to Wales, Cornwall, and onto Ireland. Other birds that have moved up, another bird that's moved up and down England and Scotland. And then another interesting touch, so this previous orange bird, which moved within Scotland, she came down to England, into East Anglia, pretty much passed over where I am now, for that matter, and interestingly, ventured into London. So this is a park in Wormwood Scrubs in October 2018, and apparently for a night it had a short-eared owl in residence, which, well, we would never have known otherwise, except for pure fluke. So this is somewhat unexpected. We do have some other long distance movements too. So we have that original bird is now in green, unfortunately. But anyway, we have another bird that went to Norway. So this was a male, bringing the same area as that female. He bred in Scotland 1 year, and then the next April he headed straight to Norway. So we didn't see him scouting the area. So Norway he might have done before he was tagged. But anyway, he settled down there to breed, but unfortunately appears to have been predated soon afterwards. So he didn't manage to raise any chicks. But as you can obviously see, we have 3 birds that have gone to Africa. And if you remember back, I showed you the recoveries map of ring birds. We did have a bird from Morocco, so, and for that matter to Malta. So these movements, these ridiculous movements, actually are not rare, including, although perhaps going via Russia, well, the Baltic countries and Russia probably is. So over the course of the study, which has kind of wound down now, but we and some international collaborators in Iceland and elsewhere tagged 23 birds, producing, I think it was by the end of the project, it was more like 20,000 accurate locations. So that's really valuable information. And we followed their adventures. One thing we can say is that I mentioned the fact that they appeared to not live very long. And I think we can see why. If they are doing these frankly insane movements to and from different parts of Europe and beyond, presumably looking for places to breed. So we have 3 birds that have gone to the desert, sadly died, one of which was picked up by a local ornithologist for us, so we do know what condition they were in. A bird that was hit went to France via Ireland as well, which unfortunately must have been hit on the motorway in France, as well as our birds going into the sea or Norway. So these birds are living a dangerous life, and it could be contributing to the fact that they're declining, or it could be this is just how they do it, and they roll in the dice, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So this has been a massively informative study, albeit still with plenty of things we don't know. So unfortunately, it has wound down to an end, in part because the tags are incredibly expensive. They're about £3,000 a piece, so we have to use these carefully. But I like to think even just our information, the breeding season has been really helpful. Never mind the movements abroad. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to all our volunteers and people who helped fund our research, and the photographers, of course, for the amazing photos. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hugh, for that very interesting talk. I'd like to throw the meeting open to questions, please. If you have a question, if you could put your hand up.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Are you just tagging female birds? I did hear you talk about one male. Is there any reason that you're tagging females more than males?
No, it was both.
Okay.
In some species, that is a consideration. So away from owls, the cuckoo tracking that we do, that's nearly all males because the females are slightly smaller. And so we have to balance the bird's welfare against the information they get. So it is a consideration.
And do they pair for life? Obviously, if they're traveling all over, they can't. But what is the situation with pairing, or do they just pick up a partner as they go along?
Frankly, we don't know. I think, I assume they are encountering birds and just pairing up in that particular habitat, that place they're traveling to. I find it very hard to believe they're pair faithful. Whereas barn owls, tawny owls, little owls, they don't go anywhere. They are very, very pair faithful. So, and long-eared owls, we don't know.
And do the males look after the chicks as much as the females, or do they take over? Or you mentioned something about that. So we have a number of females where it's quite clear that the female has up sticks and left the males looking after the nest. So it suggests that she is choosing. She's leaving him looking after them, and then she's going to basically look for the next place she's going to nest. And how long do they have to look after them for? About
potentially a few weeks. I think they're fairly quick developers.
Thanks very much.
Jane?
Thank you very much, Hugh. I found that really fascinating. Interesting, I actually saw a short-eared owl in Richmond Park last year, so I'm wondering which one of those it was that was passing over at the time. But the question I had was just about wind farms and whether you have any evidence of those affecting the movement of owls and deaths.
Not particularly, as far as I know. I think the problem is that 20 odd birds tagged is quite a lot, but it's also a tiny drop in the ocean for a small population. So I suspect my colleagues in BTO Scotland have looked at it, but they may well have found there's not enough data to really look at.
That was really, really interesting. I have 2 questions. They didn't seem to need any trees. We didn't see any trees at all in the heathland that they appeared.
Yeah, short-eared owls are not tree owls.
They never need any trees. Okay. And the other question is, might they travel so far because they just can't find enough birds to breed with here because they're quite sparsely
Maybe, but it does look like they've probably always done this.
Oh, okay.
They are nomadic. They are not
they're not a Scottish or a British or a British and Irish population. They are genuinely a Northern European population, perhaps more.
Okay, so they're just going back to their old roots.
Yeah. Yes, good point. I did mean they're the only ground nesting one that we have.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Hi, that was interesting. Thank you. I was thinking about the tawny owls that don't move very far. So presumably they can live in quite sort of large. They're not too territorial, presumably. I think because they obviously the chicks are not going very far from the nest.
They can be in quite high density, particularly in good habitat. So the better quality of the habitat, the more dense they are. Whereas places like conifer woodland, they do breed there, but they tend to be quite low density and spread out because it's just less suitable for them. So they adjust. So despite all the shouting you hear, they can be very close together, or they can be far apart and just come to the edge of their territories and shout at each other essentially. So, but it's hard to tell how many there are for a bird that is mostly that we encounter in the dark. We only hear for the most part. So that's where we tend to look at occupancy. Are they there or not, rather than how many there are.
Thank you.
Could I ask a follow-up question to that anyway? Given that they are pretty sedentary, presumably that means that as woodland habitat reduces, they become more isolated. It's more difficult for them to spread from one place to another.
Yeah, that is a problem in long-lived birds actually, because they live a long time. They will still be there for many years, and then all of a sudden that old bird will die, but there's no suitable habitat, so nobody moves in to replace it. So that applies in owls, tawny owls particularly, but that also applies in other birds as well, things like curlews. Once the old birds, years and years, we survey them, we hear them every year, we think it's fine. They die, there's nobody to replace them. The young birds have not arrived or they've disappeared. So they end up isolated, as you say.
Thank you. Alison's got a question.
Yes, could you tell us about the owls on the coast? Because I remember I said to you by email that a friend of mine had seen an owl on the beach at Scarborough.
Sure. So they should do shorted owls first because they are a more normal coastal owl to many people. So they occur around the coast, particularly in the winter. But we also find that barn owls, they are mostly in lowland, and so actually a lot of land by the coast is pretty good, despite the fact that they are exposed to the wind and the weather. But it's also warmer. So actually they can hang on there when they do poorly inland. So I'm from Northumberland originally, and actually in bad winters, the barn owls inland can get wiped out. But in the coastal strip, because it's warmer, they survive. And then over the next year or two, they repopulate inland. So hopefully that answers that.
Regarding barn owls, there's a pair that I know of that live on the outskirts of southern London, which appear to be pretty well entirely nocturnal. Mm-hmm. But I've seen in other parts of the country barn owls at 11 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 o'clock on a summer evening, bright sunshine. What determines what sort of time of day they're out, and is there significant individual variation on that? Do you know?
It's complicated. So in the longer form of my talk, I actually do talk about this a little bit, but more in relation to surveying. So most of our surveys are daytime surveys, and we do record owls during that. And it's a case of, if we see owls then during the daytime, what does that mean? And we've got, sometimes it's literally demands of food. So particularly if they've got large chicks, they may be forced to go out and catch prey and bring it back. So that might explain some of the daytime foraging. But if the weather is horrible, then it may be the point where birds are in poor condition. They'll be forced to go and hunt in the daytime. So daytime foraging owls can be bad, but it can also be that they're just going out anyway, and individual variation is going to play a part in that. But we don't really know.
Yeah.
When it's good, we don't know. It's hard to separate when it's good or when it's or versus when it's desperation, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I ask? I've seen a few pictures of kestrels stealing food from barn owls. Do you know much about that? I mean, presumably this is one reason why a lot of owls prefer to hunt at night, because that's not going to be an issue at night. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so collectoparasitism.
Yeah.
Correct word. But yeah, no, it's basically, for the most part, owls are wimps, particularly barn owls. Less so tawny owls. And yeah, essentially, kestrels are much more acrobatic and are quite capable of pinching a daytime barn owl's lunch, essentially. So that, I very much doubt it's just a minor low-level conflict. They're feeding on similar things, and it's literally the kestrel stealing it. Although you can get weird things where they like nest in the same nest boxes, or at least neighbouring.
Right.
So there are less things that don't involve conflict as well for them.
Right. Thank you.
Alison?
Sorry, I just have to ask, did you tell us, do you have a favourite owl?
Yeah.
Not a favourite British owl. Probably a northern saw owl in Canada, well, North America. But they're small and they migrate in big numbers. Jane?
You showed us a picture of the barn owl, the roadkill issue.
Yeah.
Is there anything that people can do to reduce that, like farmers keeping hedges higher so that they don't dip down? Is there any research of what might help?
Not specifically. We have kind of looked at this, but it's more as a kind of overview of the effects of roads on raptors. And there is potential things about basically creating habitat and things, so to force the owls to fly higher or just removing the habitat completely. But we do have the trade-off in that foraging next to roads, there's a lot of small rodents there, so it's actually very valuable habitat. And the chances are we are unlikely to ever kind of eliminate the risks of them. And we may well even we may well even end up, by allowing owls into that area, we may well still be supporting more owls, even if some of them do get hit. So I don't know what we can do effectively. One of the things because I've been involved in monitoring barn owls for a large part of my life, and often we tend to avoid putting boxes near main roads just to reduce that risk. But there will still be owls nesting close to the roads, and they will potentially still venture near roads. So there may not be much you can do about it.
Abolish cars.
It's lorries, to be fair, is probably more than.
Well, those two, yeah, obviously.
Unfortunately, yeah.
As I've seen in rural roads in Herefordshire, that these huge lorries are getting taller and taller. So guessing that the owls can't really avoid them, even if they're flying above the hedges. Yeah.
Yeah, and just drift to the side. But yeah, it's difficult to address. Simon?
Yes, hi. I was just wondering, what's the status of eagle owls in terms of any that might be breeding? I do remember seeing one long time ago at Chichester Cathedral hanging around, but I understand they do breed from time to time.
From time to time, yes. I know some were ringed in Britain a couple of years ago. And there were, for quite a few years, a pair breeding in the Forest of Bowland, in Yorkshire, I think. But currently, we don't really know. They are quite secretive, although they also, if they call, they're quite distinctive. So we do tend to find out eventually if they're there or not, but not necessarily immediately. They are very vulnerable to disturbance, though, which is quite interesting, given that they have a habit of disturbing other nests. But they do tend to abandon fairly easily, apparently. So they are difficult to monitor effectively. And there's the whole situation of whether we should be monitoring them or just getting rid of them, and it gets messy.
Thank you.
May I ask another question?
Yeah, go
on. Barn owls, I know they're found in other European countries as well. I've seen one in India. I've seen them in South America. Are they the most universal of the owls? And and when the one I saw in India was in a suburban park in a major city, so its habitat was rather different from that of the ones that we have here in Britain.
Yeah, no, they are probably they are the most widespread owl, although they are split into certainly American and Eurasian, well, common now. I'm not quite sure how there are in Australia as well, but they are mostly a tropical and subtropical species of that family. So actually, we are in the extremes of their range, arguably, which is one of the reasons why they suffer during the winter. But yeah, they are our most widespread owl, even if we take into account there's probably 2 or 3 species there. And they come in different colour morphs as well. So I mentioned a couple of subspecies, and there are others as well. And some of them are very dark.
And their adaptability to different habitats?
To some extent. Although, again, based for the most part, it's farmland. But as you say, they can turn up in some odd places, but to us at least. Including things like forest clearings, they probably would have been associated originally prior to widespread agriculture.
Thank you.
Okay, well, can I thank Hugh for a very interesting talk and Q&A session?
Thank you.
And yes, thanks a lot for that. And thanks everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you in a month's time.